questions might we tease out of this story, for example, if we were trying to be deeply instructive, even provocative in the classroom? And so to explore these questions in preparation for our panel, I interviewed a half-dozen historians who have been involved in writing or have signed on to state same-sex marriage briefs. And I asked each of them to comment off the record, so I won't be quoting names, about how we might complicate the March to Freedom narrative. So tonight I'm going to summarize a few of the overlapping points that emerged from these conversations. Now at the outset, I want to be very clear that all of my informants signed the briefs because they felt entirely comfortable with the historical interpretations expressed within them, and they had carefully reviewed what they had signed. No one felt that they had compromised any of their professional integrity by engaging in this legal process. And almost everyone, when pressed, came up with some afterthoughts worth sharing. The historians' briefs, as I've said, paint a picture of marriage as an increasingly egalitarian institution, particularly in comparison with the bad old days of coverture, when husbands legally ruled over and represented their wives. As gender relations have become more equal, so has marriage. Yet, several historians wondered out loud just how egalitarian marriage has become, and when that change took place, questioning in part the pace of change in the shift away from coverture. A few moments ago, when I read that heading from the Connecticut brief about how marriage has become gender neutral, I saw a few heads go, The same-sex marriage amicus briefs cite judicial decisions in the mid-19th and the very early 20th century to document women's expanding rights, for example, property or ownership for married women, or the ability to divorce. In teaching the history of marriage, however, some scholars ask about the extent to which coverture, in fact, continued much later than the early 20th century, indeed throughout much of the 20th century. For example, one example that I would offer, not until the 1980s did U.S. courts overturn what's known as the marital exemption in the legal definition of rape, allowing women to prosecute husbands for what has become known now as marital rape, an impossibility in prior legal terminology. I would also say that even when a legal framework of formal equality has been established, it does not fully address the institution of marriage. As one historian stated to me, the egalitarian marriage narrative is as much about aspirations as about social fact. For the remnants of coverture remain ideologically, if not formally, legally influential. Well, I think that this questioning about the pace of change might help us to explain the significance of the persistent defense of, quote, traditional marriage in our own time, a defense that informs much of the opposition to same-sex marriage. Even when social historical facts explain why marriage has become more egalitarian, facts that you've heard alluded to, such as the erosion of a strict sexual division of labor, or the declining centrality of procreation to marriage, the cultural and political potency of traditional marriage is still undeniable. And I think that the seeming imbalance between, on the one hand, the historical weakening of patriarchal marriage, and on the other hand, a deepening defense of traditional marriage just might strike a familiar chord among historians. Take, for example, in the 19th century, women bore fewer and fewer children, while the defense of motherhood, and indeed the prohibition on abortion, grew stronger and stronger. So I think that kind of seeming contradiction can be a historical pattern. Well, in this case, while most of the legal underpinnings of traditional marriage, coverture, limits on divorce, the marital rape exemption, have been overturned, I think that defining marriage today as the union of one man and one woman just might represent a kind of last stand for traditional marriage in its shaky historical moment. I also think that questioning the direction and pace of change in marriage can lead to a related corrective in the master narrative of the March Towards Freedom. A key point in the legal briefs is that marriage is so central an institution in American social life that, in fairness, it should be extended to allow access to same-sex couples. As we know, a range of federal benefits and entitlements flow through marriage, via immigration and tax law, for example, and of course, through Social Security. And so, to gain the full rights of citizens, same-sex couples seek marriage on an equal basis with opposite-sex couples, and not merely civil unions or domestic partnerships. But another narrative would stress that, particularly in the past half-century, marriage in the U.S. and the industrialized West has been increasingly decentered and deinstitutionalized. That it is not, or soon may no longer be, the way that most people organize their personal lives. Postmodern cultures have complicated arrangements of intimacy, domesticity, and child-rearing, and indeed, same-sex couples have often pioneered these alternatives. So if they're not a competing, shall we say, declension narrative in the history of American marriage, one that might overlap with the March Toward Freedom, either on parallel or intersecting tracks. Well, related to this abstract question is, of course, a policy concern. The quest for same-sex marriage as a means of extending entitlements reinforces a marriage-based social policy trend that may, in practice, be outdated. A number of legal and political writers have questioned the wisdom of seeking to gain the rights of married couples for lesbians and gay men.